Today, I'm going to teach you how to take your concept drawings and landscape plans from a crisp black and white state to a fully fledged rendered plan that you can be proud to present. And the good news is this process is really easy to learn, and in my opinion, it's a really effective way to get drawings done quickly. So grab your pens, grab your markers, or grab your tablet, and let's get started. Now, there's a few things I like to do before I do any coloring at all. And the first thing is to take a few minutes and just inspect the state of that black and white drawing. And while you're looking at this, I want you to be thinking about two main ideas. The first is line weights. Now, line weights are incredibly important if you don't know already. It's a very key aspect into making sure that your plan is interpreted correctly. So for example, you're going to want to make sure that your details and very fine elements are going to be the thinnest line on your page, which is then going to be followed by your main site elements, your boundaries, all of your main lines. Those are going to be a little bit thicker. Then you're going to be following that with a thicker line for your walls or any vertical elements you have. And then finally, your darkest line or the thickest line is going to be for those vegetative covers. These are your trees or buildings or anything that is really high up that you're going to need to make sure that's popping out on your page. Now, if this is at all confusing, the easy way to remember this and how I remember this is whatever is the highest in terms of height when you're looking at it, two-dimensionally, that should be the darkest or thickest line. And after that, the last thing you just want to pay attention to is to make sure that whatever details you intend to have in the drawing or whatever you want, being displayed in your drawing, make sure that's already drawn out and ready to go. Now, this by nature isn't necessary because you can add to this later on, but it's just good when you're creating a palette that you have everything accounted for so that you make sure you have colors appropriately for every different element or site thing you're trying to display. Now, the last thing I would suggest, especially if you're new to this, is to find some drawings online or maybe some that your colleagues have done that you really like and you think work. You're going to want to copy that style, especially early on, because it's going to help teach you which colors sort of make sense for what you're trying to represent. Now, there's a lot of great places to find inspirational images like Pinterest or Behance, but if you are interested, I'm going to leave a link in the description below to download this workshop and this plan that we're creating today for your use. All right, that's the last of your checklist items in terms of your drawing. The last thing you want to just take a minute for is to make sure your drawing utensils are set up for your use. And for me, I like to set this up with 3 different pencil brushes. Now, I like using pencil brushes. You can feel free to use any of the other styles, but I think it works best for me. And the differences I have between the 3 is really just the level of opacity that I have setting. So for me, I set one to 50%, one to 75, and one to 100. And what this does is it just gives me options to render in at different levels of darkness without having to really go into different layers and constantly be changing things all the time. But again, this is all totally preference, so do as you please. But once that's ready to go, we're ready to actually start coloring this thing in. So if you're using Morpholio Trace, or maybe you're going to be doing this on trace paper, one thing I highly recommend, especially for the beginners out there, is to take 5 to 10 minutes to render out fully a portion of your project or your site. This is a great tip I received from a professor that really allowed me to be able to test out my ideas and my colors without fear of messing up the entire project. So what you're going to do basically with that new color palette that you have is you're going to start to fill in a portion that you'd like. Preferably, I would say, look for a portion that has a lot of different elements, so that way you can test, 75 to 90% of your palette all in that little section. And as you're doing this, don't be too specific and don't spend too much time on it. The key here is to really just get colors down to make sure that you're getting the correct feedback, making sure that what you're putting down on the page is what you're confident in and that you're gonna want to render throughout the rest of the drawing. So once you have all your elements out, one thing I suggest is to take a step back, physically remove yourself, actually get up and stand back and look at it from a distance and start to kind of see how those colors feel. Does that image pop to you, or does it all feel flat? These are all really important things and great indicators for how your color palette is working. And some pro tips for color palettes, if you're not sure what you're supposed to be looking for, is you're gonna wanna look for things that are similar to what we talked about with the line weights. And that's gonna be that your elements that are highest in the air tend to be the darkest and have kind of the deepest colors, Whereas the ones that are in the foreground, they're on the ground, grasses, materials, paving, all those things are gonna wanna feel dull and faded back like they're removed and far from your distance. These are all really great tips to get you started in the right direction. Now, what do I mean by darker or duller? Basically, if it's going to be darker, it just means that there's probably more color density to that object as opposed to something that's dull. Something that's dull, think of a pale color, or think of something that's on a low opacity that doesn't really stick out to you or is, vibrant. Whereas, the darker color might stand out more to you and is more vibrant to you. This is just gonna make sure and ensure that your drawing is popping correctly. So as you can see here, when we look at my drawing, this all feels pretty good to me. I know this, I've used this color palette many times before, so I'm confident with it. So let's make a new layer on Trace and get started. Now, in case I didn't mention this before, with Morpholio Trace, make sure you're doing this on a new layer and set that layer to multiply. This is gonna make sure that anything you're doing is not going to interfere with all that hard work and drawing you've done. And multiply is just gonna make sure that your lines and all of those, black and white marks you made are gonna seep through in that rendering still. Now this time, I want you to think a little bit more about the process and the order of operations you're gonna do as you render this thing. And this, by all means, is not the correct order by any sense, but I was always taught to do it this way, and a lot of people in the industry practice it this way as well. And that is simply to work your way up. So what does that mean? That means to start with your grasses, your materials, and anything that's on, the ground that your feet would touch first. So for me, I always like to start with the grass. I think it just gets a bunch of bulk coloring done, and it makes, the render start to feel like it's starting to come alive, and you get a bulk of that work done initially, which is just a good idea in my opinion. Now, in terms of skills or techniques that I use while I do this, it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. All I'm really doing here is two main things. One is I am rendering at a consistent direction and cadence. Why do I do this? Well, I just think that it makes the drawing really clean and consistent across the entire page. So for me, as a left-handed person, I like to just make strokes that go, from the bottom right to top left. And I try to stick to a good rhythm so that way the coverage is pretty consistent as I'm going across the page. Now, this is a bit counterintuitive at first. It doesn't necessarily feel natural, but the more you practice this, the better you'll get at it. And the better you'll start to be able to look ahead to make sure that, you have that consistent cadence, either if it's a really wide distance that you have to cover or a very narrow distance that you have to cover. And then secondly, on top of this, the other thing I like to think about is, something we all probably learn in grade school, which is just to stay within the lines, sort of. Now, why I say sort of is because if you look at a lot of great, hand renderings, you're gonna notice that they're not always perfect and there's some imperfections in there. And those imperfections actually, I think, improve the quality of that drawing. I could not tell you why this is. I think our brain doesn't necessarily like to see things perfectly. They like to see a little bit of imperfection and like to see the kind of colors bleed over into other objects, because that's probably in reality how you would see a landscape anyways. To me, the only way I've learned to do this without it seeming forced is to honestly just try to color in the lines the whole time. And if you do make a mistake, just leave it. This is probably the only way that I'm able to do it without making it seem like I'm doing it too much or too little. If it happens, it happens. And if it doesn't, that's cool too. So take a stab at this, do all your different colors, all of your different ground level materials, and make sure you're doing your paving, your water features, your landscapes, your meadows, all those elements that you have. Let's get those in there now, and then take a step back and take a look at how it feels. Now, before you proceed on to the next layer of the render, one thing I like to do is totally optional, but with my grasses or my paving patterns or my meadows, sometimes I'll go back with a slightly different hue or a slightly different variation of a color and start to kind of feather in just to add a little bit of texture to that flat color. Now, you can do this in two ways with Morpholio Trace. You can just simply do this right on top of it, or if you're nervous about it and not sure you want to go this route, just make that new layer, set it to multiply, and just draw over it and see if you feel comfortable. If you don't, no worries, you just clear it, you delete it, and you move on. This is why I really love drawing in Morpholio Trace, is it's just such an effective way to render without fear, knowing I can use the back arrow or I can always adjust things later on. But now that I'm feeling good about it, we can move on to the next layer, which is gonna be our trees and our vegetation. This process is no different from the rest. You still wanna keep that same cadence. You wanna make sure that you're going at a consistent rhythm. You're coloring sort of in the lines, but not really. All those things are true throughout the rest. Now, one thing I like to do with trees specifically is I like to create a duplicate layer in Morpholio Trace when I am done to add a bit of texture and hint at the idea of sun and shade within that tree layer. Now, to do this in Morpholio Trace, it's really easy. Just head on over to the layer that your trees are on, hit the More button or the ... hit duplicate, and then go back into that duplicate and do scale and move and shift it down to the bottom right. And it's gonna add you a little bit of texture, and it's gonna make it look like it pops a bit more, and it's gonna hint that the sun is up in the north left and the shade is down to your bottom right. This is a very small detail that a lot of people I think just skip over, but it can add a ton of pop to your drawing and really make it stand out. You can of course do this manually, but I just think it's really easy to do this right now, with the layer states. And speaking of how to make a drawing pop, you do not want to skip the final step, which is adding shadows to your render. This is easily the thing I overlooked the most in all of my drawings. And until I started to do this, my drawings were always flat and they just never quite felt to the level that I've seen other people draw at. And the thing is, this is so simple to do, and it really takes 5 or 10 minutes to do correctly. So again, before you do this, make sure you're on a new layer, set it to multiply, and then you're ready to go. So what do you want to put shadows on? You want to put shadows on anything that is vertical. So this is any vertical element that you have. Site walls, inside copings of water, chairs, furniture, trees, buildings, all those things you're gonna wanna put a little bit of a shadow on. Now, really the only rule you need to follow is to make sure that whatever direction you choose is consistent across the board. This is absolutely critical to making sure that your drawing looks realistic and that it feels correctly with having the shadows all go to the same direction. Now, I know people teach this differently across the country and probably across the world, but I've always taught that shadows should be to the bottom right of your drawing. Some people, I think, do the top right or bottom left. I can't remember, but I've always done the bottom right. I've always seen drawings at the bottom right, so that's just what I've always done. But the main thing, again, whatever you choose to do, just make sure it's consistent. You can actually do it by true north if you want. Most people don't care, they just want to see some sort of shadow on there. Now, the other thing you're probably wondering is, okay, how much of a shadow do I draw? How big is it? How wide should I make that space? And the answer is really dependent on how vertical that element is. So for example, you're probably going to want to have the longest shadows on your trees and your buildings, as those are highest in the air. Then a tier below that is probably going to be any site elements that are vertical, like your walls, any arbors, things like that are probably going to want somewhere between the buildings and the smallest level. Then for your smallest level, these are going to be things like chairs, cars, people, furniture, anything like that. They're going to want just a little bit of a touch of color under there just to get it to separate and pop up on that screen. And lastly, a lot of people, struggle with how the shadows kind of are laid out. The easy way to remember this is think of that sun direction. So that means that if you're looking at something on the plan and we're drawing a shadow for the bottom right, we know that our sun is in the top left, which means that we're not going to see any shadows on the top or the left portion of our element. We're going to see shadow or darkness on the right and the bottom portion. Then just feather, the bottom and right side to, angle with that top corners, and it's gonna look perfect. Doing all these things is just gonna ensure that your drawing is consistent and looks really, really well at the end of it. But all right, that is your shadows, and that should be completing the rest of your drawing. So now the last thing I would suggest everyone do is to take a minute, get out of your chair, take a step back, and view your drawing and your colored plan from a distance that you think it will be viewed from. And as you're doing this, pay attention to what you're seeing. Is this something that is standing out to you? Are the right elements being, shown to you from your eye? You're gonna wanna make sure and look for these things, as it's gonna help you understand what that person is going to see when they look at it for the first time. This is a really key element that I think a lot of people overlook. Because, as you, the designer who's done this, you already know where you want to look and where you want to go with your drawing, but you don't necessarily know where the others are going to look. So if you can kind of take a step back and look at it through the eyes of a first-time viewer, this will help make sure that everything you're trying to represent is represented properly. Now, in addition to making those final tweaks and looking at, your layers and how much opacity is on or off, one thing that you can do that sometimes makes your drawing feel a little bit better or a little bit looser, like a concept, is to kind of feather out the edges and erase some of the outer content so that it's not, a direct square or rectangle. Again, this is totally optional, but I think a lot of times this helps make a drawing look not finished, which tends to make it feel a little bit more concept-y, which makes it, feel a little bit better, like it's a true sketch, rather than these harsh borders, which makes it, seem like it's more polished. This is totally up to you, but it's something that I like to do on a lot of my concept drawings. It's really easy to do this. You just use the eraser and just select the different layers and go around in a consistent pattern, and it'll start to feather out those edges for you. But all right, you're probably good to go and ready to export. So head on over to the export tab and make sure you save and export in the highest quality settings. That's it. That's how to render a concept plan in Morpholio Trace. So I hope this video was helpful, and I hope that you learned some great tips and insights on how to use Morpholio Trace and also how to render properly as a landscape architect and make some great looking concept plans. So let me know in the comments below what you think about this style, and if you thought that this was easy to follow along with and easy to create a render like this. And again, if you would like to see exactly how I created this render or use any of the elements or palettes or anything at all that you see in this video, I'll have a link in the description below to download a pack that has this palette and a bunch of other assets and things that you can use for your drawings. Anyways, that's all for today's video, so be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for all things landscape architecture from me in the future. And as always, thanks for watching, and here's some videos about landscape architecture that I think you will find valuable next. Peace.